The girl, who would meet many more times in the story, was talking to a man who had hair like a raven's wing. She said she would take and ruin their lives in a humiliating and insignificant way. This girl had beautiful milk-colored hair and ruby eyes. She is going to destroy them painfully and agonizingly. They will suffer torture in hell without a shred of hope. Those people she knows well will be like an unsuspecting chess piece being manipulated. And when her usefulness is drained, she'll be shattered. The guy, after listening carefully to the girl, said he felt as if her whole life consisted only of revenge. However, the girl did not object, because that was the way it was. After all, those who had wronged her all this time must pay for everything. Sometime before the whole story, this very girl was in prison, cold and alone. She looked at her left leg and realized that because of the hard blow, she couldn't even feel it. However, the girl tried not to think of bad things, because her brother should soon come and save her. So she just had to hold on a little longer. And then a woman and the man beside her approached her. As soon as the girl looked at them, she immediately recognized that it was Valentine. The girl who came in immediately said hello and told Sister Neris that she didn't have a good look. And the girl looked at it and realized that it was the ceremonial dress of the members of the imperial family that she wore. And when Valentine noticed her look, she asked, "Is she really that surprised by the ceremonial dress?" After that, the girl spun around and said that, as expected, it suited her better than her sister, both in dress and in her place as crown princess. The girl felt unpleasant at these words, and she immediately asked Valentine, did she really come to mock her? One cat was surprised and asked, "What mockery?" She came to see her sister's end. Neris was surprised to hear about the end, and asked her what she meant by that. Then the girl said that despite her low origin, she had the traditional eye color of their family, and a pretty good brain too, so she was quite useful. But then she grinned evilly and asked, "Is a doggy useful that has long since expired? Isn't it time to die?" Neris, when she heard this, asked, "Did they really intend all this from the beginning?" She asked, "Are mother, father, and herself involved in this?" But Valentine answered nothing. She turned to her companion Joseph and told him to hold her. The man nodded and immediately ran to Neris to grab her. The girl didn't understand why and for what reason all this was happening to her. Then she looked at her sister and said that she had done everything they said, hadn't she? But Valentine would not listen to her. Then the girl told Joseph to let go, for she was the younger sister of his master, Nelison. But at that moment the man grabbed her even harder, pressing her shoulders so that the girl fell to the floor. Neris looked at Valentine and asked in a pitiful voice, "Does Nelison's brother know about this too?" But to this the girl only smiled, and for a while just stood there silent. And afterward, she made a bow and said that because before that now, people use her like an idiot. And then with her foot, which was wearing a shoe, Valentine stepped on Neris's sore foot. And when she did, the girl cried out in pain, and Valentine laughed as hard as she could. And afterward she asked contemptuously, "Does she really still think she's Master's little sister? She still continues to talk nonsense." Then Valentine approached Neris, who was trembling in pain from fear, and said that she would tell her something interesting and informative. Then the girl said that killing her mother and setting her up was all planned by one man, namely the brother she so desperately followed and trusted. Neris, when she heard all this, was shocked. She said in a quiet voice that Nell's brother couldn't have done it. However, Valentine said that it was true that it was easier for their family to become independent from the Empire because of their elder sister. Then she pulled out a vial of bright purple liquid and said that as a reward, she would send her to the other world without any pain. This purple liquid was very beautiful, however. Its flavor was not pleasant. At that moment, Valentine stepped closer to her and told her dear sister to open her mouth. Neris tried to resist, but it was no use. Valentine had already come over and poured the liquid into her mouth, telling her that at least she had learned the truth before she died. And she asked if the girl didn't want to say thank you for being able to go to the other world, absolutely without any pain thanks to Princess Camille's grace. When Valentine talked to the woman, Camille said that the body could be useful too, so she asked to deal with her securely. Gently, however. Neris, hearing all of this, was astonished. She didn't think that Princess Camel would be involved in all this too. When Valentina looked at her sister, she smiled and said she did a great job, as well as suggesting a piece on the chessboard. And with those words, she poured the rest of the liquid directly into her mouth. Neris's mind kept going back to her last words about the piece on the chessboard. The girl did absolutely everything and more for the Empire and her family, and they take her and throw her away just like that. But Neris did not understand what she had done wrong then. It was because she was a person of low birth that she had such eyes. The girl's mouth was already starting to bleed, and she couldn't believe that just because of the color of her eyes, she was being killed. It's not fair. And at that moment she fell to the ground thinking only one thing, that she was cursing all of them. After a while of darkness, the girl heard a distant voice. It was very familiar to her and so dear to her. Neris opened her eyes. Her tears were still flowing, and she heard someone calling her name. At that moment she looked up and saw her mother. The woman had a very concerned look on her face and asked her daughter why she was crying. But the girl replied that it was nothing like that. Then the mother said she had to go and asked if she was ready. Neris turned to her. She was an insanely beautiful child, and then even her mother couldn't take her eyes off her for a second. The girl said she was ready, and when she saw that her mother had a strange look on her face, she asked what was wrong. The woman smiled and said she just thought for a second, as if she had abruptly become an adult. Neris replied that apparently her mom was upset that she was leaving today. The woman said she was too, but for the last few days. She didn't have time to finish because the girl immediately ran up and hugged her, asking her that she had probably seemed a little strange the last few days. Neris explained that apparently she was a little nervous about going to the academy, but that she was fine now. She remembered spending days together with her mom when she was very young, and told her not to worry about it. And at that moment she thought that this time she would definitely do it right. 120 years ago, with the support of Princess Katarina, the nobles asked the mind of the Empire to share knowledge with them. And the place where they all gathered, that is the current Cathan Academy, which is located in its center, is called Nobel Academy. For lower-class nobles like Neris herself, training depends on the economic situation. However, the children of the higher nobility, including the royal family, must receive compulsory education there from the age of 12 to 19. So the academy can be called the very center of Katina. Despite paying lip service to it and calling it compulsory education, in reality the kids are still like hostages there. And so, when Neris had already gone outside to go to the academy, someone called out to her. It was a woman. She approached her and asked her if she lived nearby and asked her to show her the way. Then Neris looked contemptuously at the girl and asked if she was saying that to her now, and added that she was being too rude for nobles, and she was the daughter of a knight. The girl was startled when she heard this. She apologized immediately to Miss, to which Neris replied that she had had enough and could go. But at that moment, the two of them heard someone's laughter. It came from a carriage that was standing nearby. A girl with brown hair sat there and said that her maid was rude. However, she only wanted to ask for directions, and the girl asked if she could forgive her. Then she got out of the wagon, and turning to Neris asked if she was one of Elandria. Neris was surprised and asked why she thought so, and the girl said that, judging from her eyes, she didn't think she was an ordinary daughter of a knight. Among the 3 warriors who defeated the fierce dragon, it is the eyes of Buddha that are the symbol of Elandria. The Buddha's eyes are precisely those of the very person who looks at all living beings with compassion. Each of the descendants of the 3 warriors are born with different character traits, and these traits are usually revealed in their very eyes. The first emperor, brave Vistav, had dark blue eyes, righteous Elandria had purple eyes, and finally beautiful Palos had gray eyes. However, their direct offspring cut short and disappeared without a trace. At a time when even Elandria's eyes were fading, Neris, a distant relative from a sideline, was born with purple eye color. And when she reached adulthood, there was even a precious skill at her eyes. Then she ascended to the place of crown princess. At that moment, a strange girl came closer to her and said that Buddha's eyes were so exceptional, so she very rarely met them. Her eyes, however, are the most beautiful eyes she has ever seen in her entire life. Neris was getting a little angry. She said in a stern voice that she had nothing to do with Elandria. In her past life, she was happy to be among them because of those eyes, but now she only felt disgusted by it. So she answered that she was from the Trid family. Then the girl smiled and said that if you think about it that way, there are other families with Buddha eyes. But Neris said they were distant relatives after all. Then the girl decided to change the subject and asked if she was a second year. Neris said no. She was only entering today. The girl replied that she sounded so confident, as if she was already a sophomore, but it turned out she was the same age as her. Then the girl introduced herself and said her name was Diane McKinnon and asked what hers was. Nerys said her name. And at that moment, she thought that if this girl was a Machian, it meant that she was the daughter of Count Machian, the owner of one of the 3 largest chambers of commerce in the empire. It was strange to Nerys, for she didn't remember them being classmates in her previous life. Of course, she didn't memorize the faces of all her classmates until 2 years later. But still. However, her attendant approached her and told her that if she stood for a long time, it would affect her legs. Diane replied that it was fine, and she was even standing normally. But at that moment Nerys looked at her leg, which was trembling all over. She could see that the girl was in pain, but she was hiding it. Then Diane called her over and asked her if she wanted to ride together in her carriage. But Nerys said there was no need for excessive civility. Diane tried to talk her down after all and told her that they didn't know the way and she had a lot of stuff. In such a situation, they would both benefit. And so after a while, they did arrive at the academy. The girls sat down next to each other and talked. Diane thanked her and said that because she had shown them the way and helped them get there, everything had gone well. Nerys replied in an indifferent voice that she was only holding her down slightly and asked if her feet always hurt like that. At that moment, Diane touched her leg and said it was fine. It's just the adults exaggerating, saying she'll have a hard time at the academy. And in that moment, Nerys realized why she didn't remember her. Apparently, the adults had been worried for a reason after all. Because the academy is really not easy to adapt even for a healthy person. Because even though they are children, they still easily figure out the weak ones, making friends in groups, vying for leadership, and thus erecting a hierarchy. And after that, they seek out their prey, for the purpose of escaping boredom by mocking the weak. That's exactly what happened to Nerys once. They bullied her all the time, and the girl couldn't fight back. Once they dragged her outside in a bad thunderstorm and tied her hands so she couldn't do anything. Nerys sat like that for a while. After that, the bullies said it was okay to bring her inside. And when they were already in the building, the girl was lying on the floor all wet and shivering. Then one of the hooligans told her not to fake it, just because she was a little wet from the rain. Another said that there are rumors that because of her Elandria eyes, she is being nominated as a candidate for crown princess. Then the other asked mockingly, did she really think she deserved this place when there was Megara? Then the other girl said with feigned concern that apparently he was less likely to have a fever, and what would happen if she got sick. The second one said that since that was really the case, we should cool it down a bit. And after that, she looked around and saw the cleaning lady's bucket and said that would be just fine. The girl mercilessly poured a bucket of dirty and cold water over Nerys' head directly. The other girl smelled the odor, said it was just disgusting, but perfect for stinky Trid. After that, the girl who had poured the bucket on her head said that if she had cooled down a little, let her tell them whether she really wanted to take the place of crown princess. Nerys, who no longer had the energy even to speak, replied in a muffled voice that she didn't know anything about it at all. Water continued to drip from her, and the girl was shivering with cold and resentment. But she didn't cry. She held herself together. That's when another girl came up to Nerys and said, that's right. She's so stupid she doesn't even know why she's being humiliated on a daily basis. She looked at the girl angrily in the eyes and told her she was an idiot and shallow and let her live like that for the rest of her life and then just die without accomplishing anything. Then Nerys was interrupted from her horrible memories. It was the master's voice that said that striving for perfection was very important. The 3 heroes defeated the word of the dragon Kion, and the Vista Empire was able to become strong through the spirit of improvement. All new students that year, and proud students of Nobel Academy. He hopes that as citizens of the glorious Empire of Vista, they will not stop in the present and seal the philosophy of Nobel Academy, but will strive for perfection in their hearts. After a while he said that was the end of it. So that was the end of the admission ceremony. Then turned to the new students and said that the dorm managers were waiting in the main hall. They would give them a tour. As the children began to disperse, Diane rose from her seat and turned to the girl, asking if they were going too. But at this moment the girl was very much afraid for Nerys, for she lowered her head and did not answer her questions. As soon as she focused her attention, memories of those days came flooding back to Nerys in an unstoppable avalanche. But after a while she pulled herself together, looked up and replied that she was fine, just a little nervous. Diane was still worried. She said she looked very pale and asked if she was sure she was all right. But at that moment the girls heard someone's voices. It was the other female students who sat in front. One of them was Crown Prince Abelis, and the other was the daughter of Marquis Lysa Andre. The other girl was surprised and asked, "Is she really aiming for the Crown Princess's seat?" But the one replied that the Crown Prince was already dating a lady. However, her name is common in high circles, and it is, after all, none other than the Megara Lyca Andra herself. After that, Neris went outside to get some air. She still couldn't believe she'd been so nervous just because she'd met Megara. The girl decided that she certainly needed to pull herself together and not give the appearance that she was afraid of anything. At this point, Neris stopped to stare and admire the beautiful view. She was interrupted, however, by a man's voice asking who she was. The girl immediately turned around and saw the boy in front of her, who said that he thought there was no one in this place since it was still vacation time. It was a pink-haired guy, and he asked who she was and why she was walking in this place. At that moment she thought it was a shortcut that she had often used in her past life. Then the stranger asked if she was a newcomer who had lost her way. She replied that she was indeed new, but that she had not lost her way. Neris noticed the leaf the guy was holding in his mouth and said that it was a basalzo after all. She said it was a forbidden item to bring onto the academy grounds. The guy waved her off and said that she knew a lot, but to mind her own business, and left. Then Neris replied that if he kept it in his mouth like that every day, he would die of intoxication from the medicinal substance. And at the end, she added his name, Ren File, and also added a particle of sunbay, because that's the customary way to use it when talking to someone older than you. The guy was surprised and said that she had said she was new, hadn't she? How did she know his name? Neris replied that it was impossible for the younger brother of former Pope Tacitus VI to have gotten such a thing on his own. Someone must have given it to him. Ren, when he heard that, was simply discouraged. The leaf even fell out of his mouth, and he wondered how she even knew all this. In fact, in Neris's previous life, this guy died alone, precisely from intoxication. She hadn't really thought about it in the past. But now the girl understands. The current pope, Omnitus III, he considered Ren to be the younger brother of former Pope Pile, the Bell of the Eye, and rubbing his trust in Ren Fail, who was heartbroken after losing his entire family and forcing him to rely on him. Omnitus gave him a poisonous herb with a powerful sedative effect, thus poisoning and causing the guy to slowly die. At this point, Neris was about to leave, but she turned to him and told him not to trust anyone. Ren, staying put and picking up his leaf that had fallen out, replied that faith was the most important thing for a priest. Then the girl turned around and looked him straight in the eye and replied that she wasn't kidding and to let him be careful. The guy was starting to get annoyed. He asked her rudely what she knew and why she kept meddling in things that weren't hers. Then Neris replied confidently that if it were her, she would surely find and avenge anyone who harmed her properly. She would. She then turned around and started to walk away, saying that she would be sorry if he died from drugs at such a young age. So let him quit it already. When the girl had already left, Ren looked at the sheet carefully and thought about it. He felt uncomfortable even after this conversation. Neris walked on, and then stopped not far from the academy, and looked at it, thinking that the humiliation of the weak was the same whether it was an adult or a child. And the place where this sort of thing happens is very often the Nobel Academy. Kartak is an all-male branch that teaches fencing, magic, politics, and theology. And Ain is the women's branch, where they teach the usual classes in theology. Nobel Academy conducts classes by dividing the disciplines into two parts. All new students take a special test on the first day, and depending on his results in each subject, they divide the children into classes. To put it another way, if you have outstanding grades, you can jump a class. After writing the exam, students immediately went to look at the results and were surprised. And soon after, Neris did pass her exam and ended up in the very first place among the students. Diane, who was sitting next to her, said she was the one who had hoped they would take the class together, but she ended up jumping the course in all subjects. The girl replied that the core subjects are common to freshmen, so they will study them together after all. When Diane heard this, she was very excited because she didn't want to be alone in class. The girl wanted to hug Neris in a burst of emotion, but held back and said that she was amazing, knowing even such details. She began to praise her, saying that after all, Neris was very special among all the people she had met. She was the smartest and most elegant. She also won first place in the overall competition. Diane said that if she were her, she would have spread the word all over the academy. But she is silent, so to her, Neris seems even more awesome. All this time calling her by her shortened nickname, Reese. Diane said that if she didn't say her nickname, the girl would call her Nell. So Neris had to give her a nickname that only her mom calls her. But now she repeats that nickname every word. Then the girl thought about the fact that if Megara had ruined the beginning of her life, Nellison had ruined it completely. And Neris no longer wants to hear the name he used to call her that sounds so much like him. But at that moment she was interrupted from her musings by some stranger who approached her and asked if she knew her. Without waiting for an answer, the girl introduced herself and said her name was Angara Nain. She had beautiful big blue eyes. She smiled, turned to Neris and said that they had played together as children. Neris looked at her contemptuously. After that, she looked away and said that she didn't even know or remember such a name. Then Angara repeated that they had walked together in Lewin Forest and played floating boats made of leaves in the creek. At that moment Neris herself thought how could she not remember her. It was impossible to forget her, who had been the only best friend she had ever had, or indeed a friend at all, abused only to get close to Megara and self-gratify herself at her expense. Neris answered her without enthusiasm that she would ask her mom later. Maybe she could give her some pointers. Angara was a little upset, but she didn't give any sign, and asked which teacher she was taking lessons from. Since they're from the same feud, maybe she knows that teacher. She needs some training too. The girl, not one, laughed. Then Neris looked at her carefully and replied that she was just lucky. I thought to myself that she would probably behave the same way in this life, so there was no point in getting close to her, and things would be different from now on. Neris wondered if that answer would be enough for her. She firmly decided that she would no longer trust her friend to be cruelly abandoned. Angara, a little saddened, said that was enough for her. But at that moment another girl came up to them. She said it was impolite to eavesdrop, but she couldn't stand by at a time like this. She looked at Neris and asked what was so secret that she had trouble telling her teacher's name. Then the girl came closer to her and asked her with insistence whether she had become conceited just because she had won the first place. And she asked if it was possible to get the first place only due to luck, and without preparing for the exams at all. Neris replied that her father died when she was still a little girl, so the family was not rich enough for her to have a teacher. She then turned her back on her and added that even now, distant relatives were paying for her tuition. And at the end she added to this girl named Rhiannon Berta that it was different from her, for she is the granddaughter of the Count. Rhiannon got angry and asked if she really meant to say that she really only got first place because of luck, or if she thought everyone would believe that, yeah, she probably just took it and cheated. Neris didn't even raise an eyebrow. In a calm voice she replied that she believed, whether she did or not. However, this information is true. She learned the sacred language from the village priest, that's all. The girl laughed and asked if that priest hadn't taught her manners, but since she said she didn't have a teacher, she really hadn't been taught etiquette. At this point she wondered, should she rejoice and call it a relief that this girl was actually no different from the old version of herself? Rhiannon was so humiliating to her then, sure that everyone would and immediately take her side. After that, she said that even though she is the daughter of a knight, she is a ska waranga. Is she immediately obligated to endure such treatment given the county's curriculum? It must be frustrating that her grades are better than Rhiannon's. However, looking at her behavior, the girls are beginning to wonder if she has really learned etiquette. In fact, kids follow the current all the time, and sometimes the current won't always be on her side. At this point, the other girls had already intervened in the conversation. One of them said that she was the one who was being stubborn and trying to break up the quarrel by sarcastically answering questions, while another added that she only saw it as an explosion of her inferiority complex. But at that moment another girl came up to them. She had fair brown hair, and she said that the lesson would start soon, and why they were making such a fuss, she didn't understand. It was Megara. She turned to Neris and said that Rhiannon had behaved so rudely because of simple jealousy. But then she added that it turns out that she got first place by practicing completely on her own. This is really amazing and needs attention." The girl smiled and said this was the first time they were meeting, so she would introduce herself. She said her name was Megara Lycandra. She suggested that we live together as friends, like the first and second place winners. She smiled evilly. You could see a hint of insidiousness in her eyes. But at that moment, a man walked in and asked what they were all doing instead of preparing for class. After that, he stood behind the counter and put his papers on the table, saying that he would hand out the test results and their schedules, so they should take their seats. Then Megara was about to leave to take her seat, but Neris called out to her. The girl turned surprised looking at her. She asked to accept her greeting as well. After that, she also smiled evilly and told her to take care of her. In fact, in the academy, at the beginning of the semester, students are divided into strong and weak students. While the teacher went around handing out the examination results sheets, he told some students his opinion. While he handed out the sheets, Neris sat there, not understanding what the criteria for dividing into strong and weak were, and why she was then among the weak, and she was obliged to endure such treatment for so many years. At that moment, the teacher called the name of Megara Lycandra. He gave her the examination paper and told her that she had done an excellent job and had won second place. He also added that she has jumped the course in some subjects, so be sure to have her check her schedule before going to class. Megara smiled at him and thanked Sir Sheridan. The girl was very good at pretending to be nice and kind. As she found the schedule, some of the girls looked at her and began to whisper. One of them said that people from Lycandra's family were different after all. The second one confirmed and said she was just amazing. Then the teacher said the next one was Neris Trid. As Neris approached the teacher, she thought she might be having fun seeing Megara's childhood. After all, she who had always pretended to be good and looked at everything from the outside with a smile on her face, now couldn't hide her emotions at all. And that was indeed the case. Megara was very upset and angry at the same time. She seemed to have a plan for revenge already in her head. At this time, the teacher told Neris that she had answered all the questions absolutely correctly, and that was excellent. He gave her the sheet and added that she had jumped all the courses except for the basic courses, which were required for everyone anyway. Advised her to check her schedule. Neris thanked him and thought to herself that she was actually quite curious. So why in that life did Megara hate her so much and abuse her so much? Nelison brought Nerison into the family and used her to fulfill his own ambitions. Nelison's younger sister, a girl named Valentine, must have hated her suddenly appearing out of nowhere for being the crown princess. And for Prince Abel, Neris must have been an eyesore because he had to take a pathetic girl like her as his wife. But the academy girls in Megara's possession had no reason to get emotional over her. She hadn't given any reason for even that. Neris was about to sit back down in her seat then, and thought that even though nothing would change, even if she did find out the reason. At that moment, the girl heard Rhiannon say in an indignant voice, but quietly enough, that she was being so arrogant and didn't even know her place. And now it was clear to Neris what the matter was all about. It was all because of an inferiority complex, as well as jealousy that the daughter of a low-ranking knight had better grades, and even unusual eyes. They may be superficial, but no emotion is as pure as this anger and jealousy in the same face of Rhiannon. When the lesson was over, the girls went from class to class. Diane came up to Neris and asked if she really didn't know Rhiannon. Neris replied indifferently that yes, she didn't even remember her at all, and there was no hint of who the girl was, or if they had even met. Diane replied that if she said so, then she meant it. Reese interrupted her and said that her class was about to start. Shouldn't she get going? Diane realized it was about time, so she asked her friend she should have a class right now too. However, Neris replied that she still had some time, so she wanted to walk around a bit and look around the academy. Diane looked at her friend with such a sad look and said she wanted to go with her too. The girl looked at her and smiled and said that they would walk together another time. They still had a whole year of school ahead of them. Before Diane left, Neris looked at her and thanked her for the recent. The girl became very pleased at these words, and she said they would see each other later. And so, with Diane gone, Neris thought she would now go to her secret place in Zachariah's library. Saint Zachariah made great contributions to modern medicine in the distant past. In her honor, the Empire built a library in the academy. However, since the nobles avoided practicing, the library was always empty. Therefore, this place was especially deserted. This marvelous library was Neris's only refuge in an academy that was like hell. Neris decided that there she could think about how to proceed. This tower was out of sight. Of course, that was the girl's plan. However, it didn't happen the way she expected. When Neris arrived at the library, she was met by some man. He put his sword right up to her face and asked her who she was and what she knew about this place. But at that moment, Neris thought it should actually be her question. She had never crossed paths with anyone in this remote place. The man was starting to get angry, and he told her to answer him. This stranger was a fellow named Cladwin Mainland. He was the successor to the only Archduke family in the country, and after graduating from the academy, he repressed all the family elders who opposed him succeeding to the title and ruling the northern part of the empire. However, Abalus and the other nobles mocked him, calling him a cruel, low-down monster. Neris had never had the chance to cross paths with him in her past lives, and she couldn't even think she'd run into him in this very place. The girl was quiet for a bit, asking what kind of etiquette it was, this kind of out of the blue pointing a sword at a person. Cladwin got angry and told her to stop straying off topic. Better let her answer who she was and how she knew about this place. Neris replied that she was a freshman and came to the library to just get a break from everyone and be alone with her thoughts. The man said it wasn't a place a freshman could know about, so let her tell the truth. The girl thought he was right about that. Cladwin looked directly into her eyes and noticed that her eyes were ruby-colored and called her eyes Buddha eyes. Then he said that he had heard that the descendants of the direct line of Elandria did not have Buddha eyes, and asked if she was an illegitimate child. Neris replied that she was not an illegitimate child, but merely a distant relative. Guy summarized that this meant she was a perfect relative of Nellian. The girl started to move his sword away from her face and said that to be precise, she did. But she didn't want to be associated with him in any way. Cladwin thought, not realizing what kind of girl was this, touching his sword fearlessly with her bare hands, when he turned to her, putting his blade away, and told her that she was a distant relative of Elandrius, but didn't want to be associated with Nellison. He was about to ask something, but Neris replied that she didn't want to talk about it anymore. At the end, she said his name, Cledwinu. Hearing this, smiled and said that she knew who he was after all. He moved closer to her and told her she was an intrepid freshman, asking her what her name was. He thought it would be fair for him to know her name. Neris said she'd figured out his name herself, so he could find out hers himself if he was that interested. The guy didn't say anything to that. He just stood there looking at her. Then Neris turned around and started to walk away, saying that if he had no more business with her, she would be on her way. Cladwin looked at her enigmatically and said he would be sure to give her name next time. Abalus had always called Cladwin cold-blooded, but she thought he hadn't really seemed that way when they'd met. Even Neris's emotions are unknowingly confused. She certainly doesn't believe Abalus's assessment. Perhaps Cladwin is a very good man indeed. But at that moment, someone called out to her. When Neris turned around, she saw a guy she had met before. It was Ren. When he saw her, he said that she liked to stick her nose in everything. And then he added that she was a senior citizen. I wonder if she's lost again. Maris replied that she wasn't lost at all, and she was actually having a diplomatic Verlinsky 3 class here. Dick, when she heard this, was very surprised and asked if she really listens to these classes. It is an advanced course among the elective subjects, so only a small part of the students take it. Afterwards, he smiled and said it was very unusual. After all, they shared a couple and asked her what her name was. Mary immediately said her name. Then Ren joked and said that she probably didn't know how to get to the office, and added that he would show her everything now. Then they went, and Neris asked why on earth he was studying Verlaine. This is a subject that theological students choose very infrequently. Ren said she knew too much for a freshman, but then replied that his maternal uncle lived in Verlaine. He already knows a little bit of it, but he applied because he thought it would be easier to communicate if he went there. His language skills are good. At this point, Neris thought that if this was Phael's brother's maternal uncle, he was a close associate of Omnidus III. Before entering the office, she thought she would have to tell him to be careful with that uncle. And when the door opened, Neris immediately saw a familiar face. It was Megara, also sitting in the auditorium. Megara, seeing those who entered, was very much surprised and asked, "Is she also listening to this subject? She's so glad to see her." The girl also added that if she had known that Neris was also listening to him, she could have sat together, but she had already sat with her brother Mahradi after all. At that moment Neris thought, how could she not know about this? There were two reasons why she, a freshman, could take the advanced diplomatic Verlensky course. That's because Nuris, the only incoming student with perfect grades in all subjects, wrote on a test paper that she wanted to take advanced courses in Verlensky. Amigara, unlike her, crawled her way into these courses after learning that she was attending the subject with the help of her family's power. The girl turned to Neris and said she was sorry, but it couldn't be helped, and offered to sit together next time. Neris thought for a while, then smiled and said she was fine with it if they could make it work. Megara shamelessly came in trying to prove that she was as good as the inferior girl who took first place. At that moment, the guy who was standing next to her turned and asked Maggie if she knew her, and if he knew her family. But Megara replied that not at all. She had won first place in those exams. Then the guy remembered and said that Neris was the girl who passed everything without a single mistake. Maggie held back her anger. She turned to the boy and wondered if the rumors had gotten to him. But then she added that if she won first place, that would also be bragging to everyone. At that moment, Ren, who was standing nearby listening to their conversation, wondered if she was trying to surreptitiously bully. Neris turned to Megara and said that it was a shame, but she didn't have as many friends as she did. So bragging wasn't really an option. Anyway, since it was an advanced elective, she would be formidable if she was the only freshman. And she also added that it was good that she had somehow gotten on this course. Now she wouldn't be lonely. Maggie smiled and asked, "Yeah, isn't she really happy about that too?" Then they took their seats. Ren looked at the girl and thought she was good at attacking elegantly. Neris, when she noticed him looking at her, immediately turned around and asked what he wanted out of. But the boy replied that it was nothing, and smiled at her. After a while, a teacher came in to see them. He turned to the students and said that those who had studied international politics already knew him. And for the others, he said his name was Henri Voltaire, and from this day forward he would teach them Verlaine. Afterward, he said he really hoped the students had time to read the example Verlaine text he had given them earlier. And after that, Henri switched to Verlaine and told them to try to translate it according to the context and situation. Neris at this point thought it was to be expected of the diplomat Sarah Voltaire, asked a question so appropriate to him. But at that moment, someone raised his hand. The teacher was immediately distracted and noticed that it was Megara. The girl stood up and said that Kinsey Lion Moaners would try to improve the windmills of Gaul. However, he failed due to lack of budget and was killed by the locals. The girl translated the text that the teacher asked for. The other students, hearing all this, began to whisper. One of them said that she seemed to be a first-year student, but she had done well in the transfer. Another heard that the student who had gotten the highest score on the exam was taking the course with them. The other said not at all. She is the daughter of Lika Andra's family. She, his Shibal, got the other. The teacher stood silently for a while listening to all this. Then Henry looked at Neris Tritt and wondered if she thought the same. But Neris said she was not wrong, but the answer is also not correct. And at that moment, she thought that nothing would work out for Megara, and there would certainly be no next lesson for her. But at this point, some students were shocked. One girl asked, "What nonsense is right? It's right and wrong, it's wrong." Another guy asked, "Isn't she showing off too much now just because she got first place in her exams?" The teacher continued speaking in Verlaine, and said that she did not make a mistake, but she did not answer correctly. Then what was her answer? He asked this, addressing Trid. Neris said Livingston, the ambassador sent to Gaul, tried to implement popular policies to improve relations with the locals. However, there were restrictions on support from the home country, and he was eventually killed because the allocated budget ran out. At this point, Maradi jumped up from behind and shouted that this was the wrong answer. The teacher tried to calm him down, answered that it was indeed completely different from Lycandra's answer. He turned to the girl and asked her to explain why she had interpreted the text that way. At this point, Megara wondered if she hadn't made any mistakes in her vocabulary, and what Neris was hoping for anyway, showing off like this. Neris said that Kinsey, which Megara interpreted as a human name, is pronounced kanji in Verlaine. A kanji is used in Verlaine's diplomatic context to refer to an ambassador. Megara was shocked when she heard this, but she put on a fake smile so as not to ruin her image. The girl kept talking and said that also the word windmill is interpreted as a continuous flow in a certain range. Neris translated the content of the example sentence as meaning that Ambassador Linguistin was killed because of the failure of his policies. The teacher became serious and said that this was a free translation rather than the literal meaning. She added many inferences of her own. Neris replied that she just assumed that was what he meant. The girl wasn't going to back down. She also added that he had earlier said to interpret the sentence according to the context and situation. In addition, this class is a Verlaine class on diplomacy. She said that Sir Voltaire was also a diplomat, so she thought that was what he meant. At that moment, the teacher smiled, but then he got serious and asked why she thought they were all learning a foreign language. Was it to communicate with foreigners? But in that case, it would have been quicker to hire an interpreter, or to use the publicly available Lund language. And he asked, then why else would you learn the language of a foreign country? There was complete silence in the audience, and after a while Neris replied that it was to gain the upper hand in diplomacy. Henry replied that this was correct. They all learn a foreign language in order to improve their diplomatic skills, and they have a responsibility to always keep that in mind. But he told them not to take the words literally, to analyze and think about the meaning, not just the information they see on the surface. If they are superficial, there will be big problems. He also said that Neris Trit is well aware of this, and can therefore listen to one subject with them. At this point, one of the students said that now he understood, and he had thought she was trying to be a know-it-all, but Neris Thrith did have some knowledge. Henri said that with that skill level, she could take advanced-level courses regardless of her grade. Then he shifted his gaze to Megara Lycaandra and addressed her specifically. The girl was even kind of scared because of that. But the teacher said that he only takes students to his classes who can keep up with him. And he asked, she got into the class because of Adam Hoffman's recommendation. The girl replied that that was exactly right. But then Henry said that after class they would give a little test on Verlaine. He asked that Megara stay late for a while, but not to worry. He would write her a letter and an explanation to the teacher as to why she would be late for her next class. But at that moment, Enim, who was sitting next to Megara, intervened in their conversation. He told the teacher what about the girl from the first year. She had to take the test too. Henry was surprised and asked the boy what he had just been listening to. In his opinion, Neris Trit had already proved that she had sufficient abilities. Therefore, there is absolutely no need for the girl to take this test. Then, pulling herself together a bit, Megara asked, what happens if she can't pass the test? The man said that in that case, she would go to a class that would be appropriate for her level. The Academy believes it is important that every pupil is educated to the appropriate level of challenge. He also added that you can't have her roommate telling her the right answers all the time. If he gives the wrong one, she will also make a mistake. Megara got even more angry. She thought she shouldn't have relied on that idiot Marathi. After a while, rumors began to circulate that Megara had been expelled from Verlaine's advanced Verlaine class due to her lack of knowledge. Her friends sat next to Megara and cheered her on. One girl told her to cheer up because it wasn't that bad, and the other added that she had heard that there wasn't a single mistake in her translation. But Trit and Sir Voltaire just decided to pick on her. She looked at Neris with the tip of her eye and said that the bad ones in this situation are Sir Voltaire and Trit. They are really annoying her. Megara replied that she should have prepared herself by training at the ducal estate level. It was her fault for being unprepared. The girlfriend, hearing this, was surprised and asked how she could belittle her knowledge like that. Anyone can get the first place if they study at the Duke's manor. Neris and Diane, who were sitting nearby and hearing all this, couldn't take it anymore. Diane turned and asked what was wrong with them, since she had already said that she had never studied at the Duke's estate. Megara was so jealous that Rhys got into an advanced class due to connections, but she was kicked out due to lack of knowledge. And after that, she still provokes a fight by telling such lies. At that moment, Neris thought that there was nothing surprising about it. After all, she was jealous. But she didn't know for sure if that was exactly the case. She used to really believe that Megara hated her because she was weird and annoying to those around her. Well, when you think of it that way, Megara's behavior was different from the other guys. Noble, brilliant daughter of a marquis, a beauty with gorgeous and rare violet eyes, proving to be a descendant of Elandria. And then, one day, before such a Megara appeared, she, the daughter of a low-ranked knight who possesses the real eyes of a Buddha, still surpassing and outranking her in grades. Megara could not bear the very fact of Neris's existence. The girl thought, could it be that these ruby eyes are the beginning and end of her troubles? At that moment, Diane looked her straight in the eyes and thought that she looked upset. Afterwards, she thought, did I behave too recklessly? Neris is more intelligent than anyone, kinder, more elegant and more mature, and she has the insight to weed out silly sycophants like Angharad. Diane thought that if she acted as uncultured as she just did, it was only natural that Neris wouldn't like it, even though she just wanted to cheer her up. The girl thought she wanted to be even more friends with Reese. But because they were listening to different lessons, there wasn't even a chance of getting close as such. Neris wasn't even thinking about anything like that at this point, just sitting there listening to Diane. But at that moment, a brilliant idea came to her about getting closer. Diane immediately ran up to the girl and told her that she was going to have a party, and she just had to come and have fun with her. Neris was surprised and asked again, is it really a party? Her friend said that yes, they would have a good time. They could be alone, or they could invite some of the other guys. Neris was a little unsure of what was going on with her, and why she was being so friendly, even though she hadn't done much for Diane. But since there was nothing wrong with being good-natured, she still didn't know if she should accept the invitation. However, she still said, all right. Diane immediately got excited, shouted out, and said they would have a good time. She is going to be sure to have a simply superb party and thus get closer to Neris. At this time in Duke Grunagol's estate, a girl named Natasha, who is the daughter of Duke Grunagol's, approached him. She was holding a stack of papers in her hands. She stepped closer to the blond man, his name was Abalus, and said that she had brought the freshman answer forms he had asked her for. He smiled sweetly at her and thanked her, calling her Sweet Tash, and told her she did a great job. After that, he started opening papers and looking for what he needed. And what he needed was the name Naris Trid. And when he did find it, he wondered. He was curious about it. Nellison, who was in the room with him, turned to His Highness and asked, what did he see there that was so interesting in the freshman forms? Abalus looked at him playfully and asked if he wanted to look at it himself. After that, he began holding out papers to him. Abalus Visto is Neris' husband from a past life, and the crown prince of the Visto imperial family. He said that the girl whose studies are paid for by his family got the highest grade. He also added that even Maharadi Enim raised a question on the matter, saying that the freshman aptitude test is not a toy. And if some lower-class noblewoman got the highest score, it means that the answers were somehow leaked or she just cheated. Nellison began to scrutinize the papers. Afterward, he asked, did a freshman girl really write this? He didn't understand how a first-year student was even capable of such content. It was clear at a glance, and the answers were written down competently, without unnecessary details. Abalus moved closer to him and asked playfully, what if she really did have someone secretly helping her? Nellison was silent for a while, then smiled and said it turns out he was testing him. He'd do something like that for some collateral relative. Abalus himself laughed as he took the documents from him and said he knew that because a complaint had been filed and he just wanted to confirm it. Henri Voltaire and other teachers assessed Anagram as an adult and kept up with high-level lessons. The man asked if they had trained her in their family, but Nellison replied that not at all. They had only recently even learned of this girl's birth. Abalus asked if she was an illegitimate child of the temple. The boy replied that according to their investigation, she was not. Then the man hesitated, and afterward he looked at Nellison, smiled, and said that meant she was a so-called genius. The boy smiled back at him and said that it must be true. He thought she was just a girl who was lucky enough to be born with Buddha's eyes. He had only thought of her that way and nothing more. But now that he found out Neris was so smart, maybe she'd be a lot more useful than he'd expected. Nellis really liked what he was up to. At this time in the library, Cledwin sat alone and looked out the window. Then he felt that he was no longer alone. He knew who it was and asked if he had finished his investigation. Then a voice came from behind the darkness, saying that of course he had missed him, and called Cladwin his dear master. But the guy told him to stop saying all that flattery. He's busy, so let him talk business. What about the results of the investigation? The voice replied that it was clear. Her mother was kicked out of the Elandria sideline, her father a low-ranking knight, and that was it. It is highly unlikely that she has any contact with the Emperor or is a spy. The voice said that since Cladwin had met her personally, he must know for himself that she was not trained. Cladwin smiled and asked, "Does he mean to say that she really just happened to stumble upon a place where he exchanges ciphers with his subordinates?" When his father, the previous Archduke, passed away, the Emperor, who had eagerly set his sights on mainland, became angry that his intrigues had failed time after time. So Cladwin already suspected that he had even recruited the girl as his personal spy. But when you think of it that way, her reaction was more an expression of questioning where he was coming from in this place, rather than her knowing who he really was. A tiny 12-year-old girl with a weak body who had never even held a sword. But behind those eyes he saw a grown man hardened by adversity. Cladwin smiled and thought that finally there was someone interesting in this boring academy. The parties held at Nobel Academy basically fall into two categories. The first is the official party, organized by the student council, to which anyone is free to attend. And the second is a party, more like a social event organized by an individual student, which can only be attended by those who have received that very invitation. Invitations to private parties were exchanged between children from families of the same level of status as well as wealth. And at its conclusion, the kids had harsh comments about whose party was top-notch and whose left a lot to be desired. And given all that, Diane's party was very different from the usual. Since it's an informal pajama party, apparently no one paid much attention. But the bedding and snacks were all top quality, and the invitees are served by well-trained servants and maids. It was truly an upscale party without any gaps. When evening came and the kids were freaking out, some girl came up to Diane and Neris. She said that Diane's party had been amazing and thanked her for inviting her. The girl smiled and said, on the contrary, thanking her for coming. If there was anything she needed, let her just turn to the servants. Neris, sitting on the couch, thought that the party was really turning out to be amazing, something she had expected from Mession County. Then Diane looked at her friend and asked if she wanted something to eat. The girl also added that she had asked for a lot of goodies to be prepared that are not served in the Academy's dining hall. She could only say so, and they would be brought right away. Neris replied that thanks to her, she had already eaten a lot of delicious things and thanked her for caring. In fact, she felt very strange at that moment. After all, Diane had done nothing for her. Neris didn't understand why Diane cared for her so much. As if a close friend, at this point another girl came up to them and thanked them again for the invitation and told them they had such beautiful hairstyles. It was Angarat, and Neris thanked her and told her she had a lovely hairdo too. Angarat was about to say something, but at that moment the guy who was walking past her with the drink was pushed by someone, and he poured the entire contents of the glass right on the girl's head. Angarat screamed and said she was very cold. There was complete silence in the room for a while, and then the guys laughed and told everyone to look at Angarat's view. She now looked like a purple mouse, perfect for her ribbon. Everyone immediately started mocking and making up all sorts of new taunts. The girl could barely hold back her tears. At that moment, someone blurted out that he felt uncomfortable and dirty just looking at her. Neris, hearing all this, suddenly began to remember her moments from her past life. How everyone had mocked her like this, called her dirty and nasty and an idiot. But at that moment she was interrupted from her thoughts and memories by a familiar voice. It was Diane. She shouted for everyone to stop. Then she pointed her finger at the guy who had spilled the drink on Angarat and told him to apologize to the girl first, because he had spilled the drink himself, and now he's making fun of her. She then went to one of the maids named Betty and asked her to help her change her clothes. Diane then sat back in her seat and told everyone that the situation was over. The chocolate cake would soon be brought from the kitchen, so let them play while they wait for it. And after that she turned at once to Neris and asked if she was all right, for she looked very pale. She took the girl's hand and moved so close to her that she could feel her breathing. She apologized and added that Neris doesn't like situations like this, after all. She would ask for milk and honey, and as soon as she drank it, she would feel better. At this moment Neris thought that surely services that don't require payment are very sweet, but they were still to be feared. After all, she could be one of the people who bullied her in a past life. But she's not entirely sure. Diane smiled and said there were more cookies with pink jam and almond chocolate. She suggested eating them for a while and playing cards. Neris at this point thought perhaps, at least for a little while, she could trust her good-naturedness, so she replied that she agreed to her offer, and asked what kind of game it was. Diane replied that her father had recently bought a game that could be played by 2 people, and began to explain the rules. Neris decided it would do no harm to consider that she was always lonely and would have a friend for a while. The next day they had class as usual, and when the lecture was over, Neris was putting all her stuff in her backpack. But then she felt something strange with her hand. Immediately she became serious. Diane noticed this and asked what was wrong with her. The girl immediately replied that it was nothing, but at that moment someone came up to them and asked Neris what was wrong. It was an Angarat. At that moment, Diane thought she was making herself self-friendly again. And that girl asked, "Is there really something in her briefcase?" Neris quickly closed her bag and wondered why she was suddenly asking such a thing. Angarat hesitated and said simply she started to open the briefcase but then suddenly closed it abruptly. So she thought there was something inside. Nellis replied that even if there was something there, it was just textbooks and writing materials. The girl was starting to get nervous, but she said she thought there seemed to be some noise coming from the briefcase, and asked if she could take a look. Neris replied that there was no need to do that. Why should the Baron's daughter look into someone else's briefcase? Angarat replied that there was nothing wrong with that. They were friends, and immediately reached out to take the briefcase from her. But Diane reacted faster and quickly snatched it away. She looked at the girl and told her to stop. Reese had already told her not to do that. The other students were already interested. They didn't understand what was going on. One of the girls said that apparently the Angarat had tried to look in Trid's briefcase. Then the whispers started. People didn't understand why she would look into someone else's briefcase. Maybe it's because she's from a rural noble family. That's why she has no manners at all. But at that moment, someone's voice caught their attention. The guy said that today's dance lesson would be in the small hall, so they shouldn't be late. Diane immediately handed the girl her briefcase and told them to be on their way. Neris thanked her for that, and at that moment, she herself thought that Angarat was not the least bit different from her past life, and neither was Megara, because inside the girl's briefcase were various spiders that were very sinister and large in size. Laris thought that they probably wanted to see her shaking with fear at finding insects in her briefcase. But she'd been through so much in her previous life that it didn't even surprise her now. Speaking of which, Angarat made a slightly different choice this time, and Neris was going to feel sorry for her at least. At that moment, the girl took out the critters from her briefcase and squeezed them in her fist, so they died immediately. After a while, they had a dance lesson. Everyone stood with each other and twirled in a beautiful waltz to a wonderful tune. Then suddenly the teacher clapped his hands and told them to now switch partners. They switched partners, and Neris was now with the guy. He said hello to her and told her she was a good dancer. The girl thanked him immediately. He then asked if she would be his partner at the junior prom organized by the school board the following weekend. But at that moment, Neris remembered how he had taunted her, putting a glass on her head and telling her not to move. She stank so badly, and if the sour milk spilled out, it would be awful. He told her to live the rest of her life with her eyes downcast. And then he turned to his friends and told them to make sure she didn't move, and if she moved even a little, it would all be in stale milk. Remembering all this, Neris closed her eyes and said that she would be busy because of homework, so she would only stop by for a little while with Diane. The boy was surprised and said it was going to be prom day after all. Is she really going to do her studies? Then he smiled and added that she was a good student after all. He was silent for a while. After that, he asked what about the party that Angarat Nain is opening this week. The whole class was invited, if she didn't mind going with him, but Neris wasn't listening to him. She was watching a couple dancing nearby. The ribbon that held back her beautiful braids was suddenly untied. Then she apologized to her partner and said she would step back for a second. Neris walked over, lifted the ribbon, and saw that the initial of the letter A was embroidered on it. She approached the red-haired girl and addressed her by her name, Alecto. She then held out a hairband and asked if it was hers. Alecto, seeing the ribbon, said yes, it was hers, and also thanked her, saying that she had almost lost it. She had bought it for a lot of money in the capital, told her to be careful not to lose it, or have someone switch it, since everyone was wearing the same ribbon lately. Laughed and said that if she lost it, it would be hard to recognize and find her. But at that moment, Electo replied that it was okay. Her ribbon has her initials engraved on it, so she'll recognize it as soon as she sees it. But at that moment, the girl got upset and said that someone had stepped on her and she had gotten dirty. The guy who was next to her said that it couldn't be helped. She would have to wash it.